Have you ever heard the term "don't get hit"? It's been said countless times all over the Elden Ring community. Sometimes it's used as a joke, responding to players struggling on bosses, similar to the phrase "get good," while other times it's a genuine justification for certain styles of building a character. Today we're going to talk about just how valid of a strategy that is, going into all the arguments and the gritty, mathy details of whether it's better to spec into more bulk or more damage. Since I previously pushed the limits of both on this very channel, I think it's safe to say I'm one of the most qualified people in the world to give you the truth, and the short answer is, it depends. And no, contrary to popular belief, your own skill level is not a deciding factor here. No matter how good you are at video games, the hard reality is that you're going to get hit sometimes. Even legendary players like Ongball or Let Me Solo Her can't no-hit a boss every single time they try, never mind bosses they've literally never fought before. Once you get hit a single time, your health becomes relevant and so does the discussion, so let's keep things realistic. Oh, but what about one-shot builds? They don't get hit. Yeah, I'm gonna get to that, random commenter. Finish the video first. Let's start with the multiplicative relationship between health and damage. From here on out, try having the mentality that health is damage, which doesn't really make sense at first, but hear me out. Let's say you're fighting a boss, and your average damage is 200 DPS, and let's say your character lasts 1 minute before dying. This means your character will deal an average of 12,000 damage before dying. Doubling your DPS would, just as you expect, double your total damage dealt. But what a lot of people don't realize is that doubling the time you're alive will also double your total damage because you'll be attacking for twice as long. Obviously in real game your numbers aren't going to be super clear cut like this, but the concept still applies in a real environment. More bulk means you live longer, living longer means you attack more times, attacking more times means you deal more damage. It might be indirect, but unless you're fighting a boss that can heal themselves, any given boost to effective HP is just as beneficial as that much more damage, and that kind of goes for every RPG to an extent, not just Elden Ring, which is why in almost every RPG I play like Remnant or Path of Exile, I have made some form of tank build because I understand the real value of living longer. In fact, in a lot of cases you can make self-healing tank builds that passively heal themselves more than the opponents can dish out, which means you have infinite effective health, which means infinite effective damage as well. You can't get stronger than infinite damage. It doesn't matter who can hit harder, what matters is who's standing at the end. And the point of a strong build is to make sure that's always you. I know it sounds like I'm going to be heavily biased towards health as the winner here, but let's reel back for a second and also understand that, by the symmetric property of equality, damage is also health. The more damage you deal, the less time you'll have to survive in order to win, which means you will take less damage and therefore have more effective health, at least relative to what's needed to win the fight. Remember how I mentioned they have a multiplicative relationship? This even goes for stacking them as well. If you were to deal twice as much damage and live twice as long, you deal 4 times as much damage before dying, which would be a much bigger revelation on most other games where a lot of the stacking is additive, but in Elden Ring, everything already stacks multiplicatively. So having a 2 times damage boost and then another 2 times damage boost would also give you 4 times damage. This means that in basically every single way that matters for the strength of your build, damage and effective health are one and the same. So that's it? They're both equal? Get both, or it doesn't matter what you spec'd into? Well yes, but actually no. There's 3 major factors left to consider: value, cost, and synergy. There's dozens of different ways to boost your character that all have different values and different costs, even if those costs aren't super obvious. Take for example, the Golden Vow buff. A lot of players would just think about it as free bulk and damage, which isn't quite true. We all know that it costs FP, but it also costs the animation time it takes to cast it. It has a time duration, so part of the cost is recasting when it runs out. It costs you a weapon slot to have something to cast it with. It costs you 25 faith if you're using the spell version. It costs you a limited consumable if you're using the item version. And most importantly, it costs you an aura buff, which means you cannot use any other aura buffs with it because they will override the effects. Most of these costs aren't even thought about because for a lot of builds, they're completely irrelevant. But those costs are still there, and still worth thinking about so you can thoroughly compare your options and pick the best one. For example, let's say you're running a faith build using fire damage against Radagon. It sounds like a no-brainer to include Flame Grant Me Strength as a buff since it's a pretty strong body buff for fire damage. Unless, of course, you consider there might be other body buffs that are useful to you, like Lord's Divine Fortification, giving you 60% negation to holy damage. I talked about this more in my defense video, but a lot of players don't understand how negation is calculated when it comes to effective health, to a point where people think negation has depreciating results as you stack more of it. I can understand making this mistake if you're the Fexter Life wiki, but this is a very normal way to see negation in the community and it really makes me sad. Once you consider negation in terms of effective health, not only are negation buffs multiplicative in all the same ways that damage buffs are, but a lot of buffs are actually way stronger than the values suggest. We're not comparing 60% with 20% here. 60% negation means 0.4 times the damage intake, which converts to a 150% boost in effective health. And that's what we're comparing to 20% boost in damage. Yeah, even if only half of Radagon's damage was holy type, that's still a 75% average boost in effective health, which is objectively stronger than any other body buff that you can put on your character for that fight. Once you consider everything in terms of value and cost like this, you'll find that choosing defensively is often the way to go. No, it's not always the way to go, but most values reflect that. You're still going to have to decide on a case-by-case basis which piece of gear is going to give you a stronger benefit to your build compared to its cost. Now, the less obvious answer, and what everyone thinks about when discussing this debate, is your stat spread. Why is 60 Vigor such a common recommendation? Does it really matter what my health is, so long as I'm not getting one-shotted? Well, the most important threshold to reach for your health is the not instantly dying threshold. Getting one-shotted is not the problem. Dying before you get a chance to heal is the problem, and it's a problem that affects players far more than they realize. Think of your total HP as not just your max health, but also the collective healing of every Crimson Flask you have, as well as any other healing sources for that matter. Every time you top off your HP, any extra healing your flask could have given you is wasted, reducing your total HP during that fight by a little bit. Every time you get hit by a combo that was just a couple attacks too long, making you die before chugging a flask, all the HP from your remaining flasks are wasted. Think about all the times you've died to a boss just barely before killing it. In those moments, 20 points of strength might have won you the fight. Now think about all the times you died before even using all of your flasks. In those times, 20 points of vigor would have likely saved you. And if that also happens to be a time when the boss was almost dead, then these times would have also won you the fight because you lived long enough to attack more. 40 vigor is usually enough to not get one-shotted by most bosses, but 60 vigor acts as insurance to make sure you get the most out of the total health you have. Much like how a VPN acts as insurance to get you the most out of your browsing experience. That's right, I get sponsors now! This video is brought to you by NordVPN. The internet is becoming a scarier place now that AI is such a big thing. You can't just expect to dodge every phishing scam, malware attack, and malicious ad you come across. Let NordVPN do the hard work for you and dodge all that nonsense by simply clicking a button and using the service. You guys know what VPNs do, you know what they're for. They protect you against a lot of the scary stuff on the internet by encrypting your data and spoofing your location. I know sometimes Elden Ring PvP feels like you're playing on Starbucks Wi-Fi, but if you actually were on Starbucks Wi-Fi, you could get hit by a man-in-the-middle attack, where a hacker pretends to be the public Wi-Fi, and in reality, they're just a computer going in between you and the actual Wi-Fi, jacking all of your personal data. Using NordVPN will protect you against this kind of thing because it'll encrypt your data before the hackers even get to it. It's also the fastest VPN I've ever used, and it's got all kinds of other bells and whistles like NordPass, which keeps track of your passwords for you while protecting them and stuff. I haven't gotten the chance to try everything yet, but the whole service seems like a one-stop shop to keep you safe on the internet. Click my very unique and easy to remember URL that I definitely know how to change in the description or the pinned comment to get the deal they've got going on right now, which is 72% off, and that just sounds like insane value. And if you don't like it, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so no risk giving it a try. Just make sure not to use Honey at checkout because they allegedly poach creator affiliate cookies and pretend they gave you the sale even if they didn't give you any coupons, so keep that in mind. Anyways, once you compare the benefits of Vigor to the benefits of every other stat, it's pretty rare to find something more useful. But keep in mind exceptions do exist. For example, let's say you're at 55 Vigor, and leveling it to 60 will increase your health by about 5%, while the same amount of points in endurance will also give you roughly 5% more effective health in terms of negation through armor. In this particular circumstance, it's better to get the armor, because negation increases effective health across the board, including all of your healing. So it's ultimately going to help you better than the 5% max health without affecting the healing. Similar situations might be that you have a weapon or spell requirement that you're really close to meeting and your whole build will increase substantially by using that new equipment. That said, these situations are relatively uncommon and only even become a conversation when you're already close to 60. So while recommending 60 Vigor for everyone isn't the perfect answer, it is generally the best answer that applies to almost everyone. It's not like you won't eventually want 60 Vigor anyway. The ideal time to start leveling your Vigor is literally as soon as possible. This is unironically a good stat for a level 80 character. The amount of value given by weapon scaling is just that bad in comparison. This is how much damage I can pull off with my level 80 build, which, mind you, only hits the minimum requirements for my essential items. And this is the exact same build, but with max defensive stats. Yeah. Not to say the scaling is worthless, of course, but more often than not, it's the last on your priority list. Only exception is for spellcasters because for some reason spell scaling is generally stronger than weapon scaling. You still usually want 60 vigor, but at least in these cases it's a real conversation whether you want more damage or more health instead of health being the obvious choice. But what about those extreme situations where the factors of cost and value start falling apart? Normally, Magic Scorpion Charm and Howl of Shibriri both have terrible value because the damage increase is matched with negation drawbacks. And according to the video so far, health and damage are one and the same, so this means they're bad, right? Well, that's where the third factor of synergy comes in. The best builds are often greater than the sum of their parts. One-shot builds don't need to worry about a health cost because they're going to kill the boss before they get hit anyway. Self-healing tank builds don't have to worry about damage because they'll never die. If you're going to kill the boss in a small handful of interactions, don't get hit is absolutely a viable way to play the game. Just in the same way that all hit runs are also viable. It's kind of like how in music theory, once you're familiar enough with all the rules, you can start breaking them in interesting ways and still make it work. The big factor in question is actually knowing what those rules are. So here's a rapid fire comparison of all your different options and which ones you should probably go for. For stat spread, you want to prioritize Vigor most of the time until it hits 60, with few exceptions being important low cost stat requirements, spell scaling if you're past 40 Vigor, and stronger armor if you're close to 60. For weapons, go for low requirement weapons first and then upgrade them instead of trying for really high requirement weapons, at least until you've already got 60 Vigor. Upgrading weapons can give it upwards of triple the damage output, it only costs runes and materials, and those materials can eventually be bought with runes as well. So when you really think about it, it's one of the cheapest and most high value ways to increase your damage in the game, since you don't actually have to compromise anything else in your build to do it. For armor, you almost always want to use the heaviest armor that you have that you can still medium roll with. Heavier armor is generally stronger, and while the exact defenses can vary slightly, there aren't really any armor sets well above the norm for their weight cost. Only real exceptions are armor pieces that give additional effects, because their value from those effects can make it worth more than the negation from a stronger piece. Whether or not those effects are going to be useful will depend on the build. For talismans, ones that give you negation are usually stronger than similar ones that affect damage, thanks to the whole effective health thing. Talismans that give percentage HP are useful as well, but it's a lot more debatable once you have 60 Vigor since you're usually already at a point where you can reliably use all your flasks. Keep in mind, if your healing sources scale on percentage of HP, these talismans will increase the healing you get as well. Otherwise, just pick damage or utility talismans that go with your playstyle. In fact, it's often worth it to change your entire playstyle into one that synergizes with more talisman, because multiplicatively stacking buffs are just that more powerful. The strongest builds often use literally everything in their loadout to increase their damage in some noticeable way. For active buffs, 90% of the time you want some variant of Golden Vow as your aura buff. There's a bunch of good body buffs options, and most of them are defensive. And then you usually want weapon buffs and unique buffs that work well with your build. Though it's not always possible to find good ones, and if your playstyle involves using a skill, you might not be able to use any weapon buffs on it, and that's okay, because the skill itself will often be just as strong. For physics, it really just depends on your build because over half of them can be useful for something. The only ones that are good for almost all builds are Opaline Heart tier and Thorny Crack tier. Keep in mind that Thorny tier only works for melee builds, so if you're a spellcaster, you'll probably want an elemental tier that fits the element you're casting. If you're doing anything with guard counters, Deflect tier is completely insane because it not only gives you Sekiro blocking, which means blocking at the perfect time is more powerful, but it also increases the damage of guard counters by up to 80% after enough deflects, which is by far the most value a single physic tier can ever give you. It's so strong that I've made two very powerful builds centered entirely around this tier. Last but not least, for great runes, you can kind of ignore them most of the time since the cost is pretty high for what they give you, but most of the time you just want Godric rune early game when your Vigor is still low, and Morgott rune once you hit late game. There might be an occasional exception for certain builds that synergize really well with a specific great rune, but generally speaking you only gotta worry about these two. Before we end off on the video, I want to go ahead and address some common arguments I'm undoubtedly going to hear once this video gets uploaded. Insert strategy here is boring. Then don't use it. This isn't a discussion of which playstyle is more fun, it's a discussion of what's more effective. You can say it's not fun all day long, and you might even be right, but that's not really relevant here. I don't think losing is fun, so I'm playing in a way that makes me lose less. Deal with it. It's not the intended Dark Souls experience to play this way. Yeah, too bad this isn't Dark Souls. This is Elden Ring. Despite the title being completely different, I can actually understand this kind of assumption, because the game's first impressions definitely give off a Souls game kind of vibe. But we are nearly 3 years past that first impression stage, It advertised a lot of its gameplay differences in the tutorial section onward, and we've had hundreds if not thousands of guides and player experiences suggesting it's more separated from the original series than people thought going in. If you've got 200 plus hours and really think it's still effectively a Dark Souls game, I don't think that's coming from a place of experience with Dark Souls. I think it's coming from a place of ignorance with Elden Ring. I used insert bad item here in my playthrough and I did fine. Yes, and many players can use a DDR controller and do fine as well. That doesn't mean it's better. Hate to burst some of y'all's bubbles here, but simply using an item is not enough to determine it's good. If you want to be 100% sure about anything like this, you have to do proper scientific method and do real testing and comparisons, which means more than just using it and seeing how it feels, because how it feels can vary a lot depending on the boss you're fighting, and it can also be affected by placebo. I know games like Elden Ring are about more than numbers, but those numbers still exist. Having more health makes you play worse. Having less adds pressure, which makes you learn faster. Yeah, no it doesn't. Pressure can help you learn to an extent, but too much can actually do the opposite. If you find yourself in a mental state where you're tilting and getting noticeably frustrated at the game, you've already reached a point where stress is reducing your cognitive function. In fact, the more we look at learning as a factor, the more things look even better on the side of health. Some of the most effective ways to learn a boss faster is practicing for a longer period of time and having more knowledge on the boss you're fighting. Living longer will help you do both of these things. If you're alive longer, that means you spend more time in the fight itself and less time respawning and coming back to the fight. This factor is smaller in Elden Ring than it was in Dark Souls, but it's still there. And then if you're not getting one-tapped by half of the boss's moveset, you have a much better indication of which moves are dangerous and what you need to prioritize learning how to avoid, making your studying plan a lot more effective and structured than the alternative, which is just hoping you dodge everything. So all in all, when it comes to health or damage being better, the overall winner is health. But you really do want both. It just depends on the value, cost, and synergy of each option. Health just has more options that give higher values compared to their damage counterparts. The big takeaway is that it doesn't matter if your build is super tanky or super DPS heavy, or somewhere in between. What matters is, are you using all the best options available to you? And the more that becomes true, the stronger your build will be in the end. Thanks for watching everyone, see you in the next video, do the algorithm crack.